This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read and recorded by William Kuhn, September 2006. Trifles by Susan Glaspell. Cast of characters: George Henderson, County Attorney; Henry Peters, Sheriff; Lewis Hale, a neighboring farmer; Mrs. Peters, Mrs. Hale. Scene: the kitchen is the now abandoned farmhouse of John Wright, a gloomy kitchen, and left without having been put in order. Unwashed pans under the sink, a loaf of bread outside the bread box, a dish towel on the table, other signs of incompleted work. At the rear the outer door opens and the sheriff comes in, followed by the county attorney and Hale. The sheriff and Hale are men in middle life. The county attorney is a young man. All are much bundled up and go at once to the stove. They are followed by the two women, the sheriff's wife first. She is a slight, wiry woman, a thin, nervous face. Mrs. Hale is larger and would ordinarily be called more comfortable looking, but she is disturbed now and looks fearfully about as she enters. The women have come in slowly and stand close together near the door. County Attorney, rubbing his hands. This feels good. Come up to the fire, ladies. Mrs. Peters, after taking a step forward. I'm not cold. Sheriff, unbuttoning his overcoat and stepping away from the stove as if to mark the beginning of official business. Now, Mr. Hale, before we move things about, you explain to Mr. Henderson just what you saw when you came here yesterday morning. County Attorney. By the way, has anything been moved? Are things just as you left them yesterday? Sheriff, looking about. It's just the same. When it dropped below zero last night, I thought I'd better send Frank out this morning to make a fire for us. No use getting pneumonia with a big case on. But I told him not to touch anything except the stove. And you know Frank. County Attorney. Somebody should have been left here yesterday. Sheriff. Oh, yesterday, when I had to send Frank to Morris Center for that man who went crazy. I want you to know I had my hands full yesterday. I knew you could get back from Omaha by today, and as long as I went over everything here myself. County Attorney. Well, Mr. Hale, tell just what happened when you came here yesterday morning. Hale. Harry and I started to town with a load of potatoes. We came along the road from my place, and as I got here I said, I'm going to see if I can't get John Wright to go in with me on a party telephone. I spoke to Wright about it once before, and he put me off, saying folks talked too much anyway, and all he asked was peace and quiet. I guess you know about how much he talked himself, but I thought maybe if I went to the house and talked about it before his wife, though I said to Harry that I didn't know as what his wife wanted made much difference to John. County Attorney. Let's talk about that later, Mr. Hale. I do want to talk about that, but tell now just what happened when you got to the house. Hale. I didn't hear or see anything. I knocked at the door, and still it was all quiet inside. I knew they must be up. It was past 8 o'clock. So I knocked again, and I thought I heard somebody say, come in. I wasn't sure. I'm not sure yet, but I opened the door. This door, indicating the door by which the two women were still standing. And there in that rocker, pointing to it, sat Mrs. Wright. They all look at the rocker. County Attorney. What was she doing? Hale. She was rocking back and forth. She had her apron in her hand and was kind of pleating it. County Attorney. And how did she look? Hale. Well, she looked queer. County Attorney. How do you mean, queer? Hale. Well, as if she didn't know what she was going to do next, and kind of done up. County Attorney. How did she seem to feel about your coming? Hale. Why, I don't think she minded, one way or other. She didn't pay much attention. I said, How do, Mrs. Wright? It's cold, ain't it? And she said, Is it? And went on kind of pleating at her apron. Well, I was surprised. She didn't ask me to come up to the stove or to sit down, but just sat there, not even looking at me. So I said, I want to see John. And then she laughed. I guess you would call it a laugh. I thought of Harry and the team outside, so I said a little sharp, Can't I see John? No, she says, kinda dull like. Ain't he home? I said. Yes, says she, he's home. Then why can't I see him? I asked her, out of patience. 'Cause he's dead, says she. Dead? Says I. She just nodded her head, not getting a bit excited, but rockin' back and forth. Why, where is he? Says I, not knowing what to say. She just pointed upstairs, like that, himself pointing to the room above. I got up, with the idea of going up there. I walked from there to here. Then I says, what did he die of? He died of a rope around his neck, says she, and just went on pleating at her apron. Well, I went out and called Harry. I thought I might need help. We went upstairs, and there he was, lyin'. County Attorney. I think I'd rather have you go into that upstairs where you can point it all out. Just go on now with the rest of the story. Hale. Well, my first thought was to get that rope off. It looked... Stops. His face twitches. But Harry, he went up to him and says, no, he's dead all right, and we'd better not touch anything. So we went back downstairs. She was still sitting that same way. Has anybody been notified? I asked. No, says she, unconcerned. Who did this, Mrs. Wright? Said Harry. He said it businesslike, and she stopped pleating of her apron. I don't know, she says. You don't know? Says Harry. No, says she. Weren't you sleeping in the bed with him? Says Harry. Yes, says she, but I was on the inside. Somebody slipped the rope around his neck and strangled him, and you didn't wake up, says Harry. I didn't wake up, she said after him. We must have looked as if we didn't see how that could be, for after a minute she said, I sleep sound. Harry was going to ask her more questions, but I said maybe we ought to let her tell her story first to the coroner or the sheriff, so Harry went fast as he could to Rivers Place, where there's a telephone. County Attorney. And what did Mrs. Wright do when she knew that you had gone for the coroner? Hale. She moved from that chair to this one over here, pointing to a small chair in the corner, and just sat there with her hands held together and looking down. I got a feeling that I ought to make some conversation, so I said I had come in to see if John wanted to put in a telephone, and at that she started to laugh, and then she stopped and looked at me, scared. The county attorney, who has had his notebook out, makes a note. I dunno, maybe it wasn't scared. I wouldn't like to say it was. Soon Harry got back, and then Dr. Lloyd came, and you, Mr. Peters, and so I guess that's all I know that you don't. County Attorney, looking around. I guess we'll go upstairs first, and then out to the barn and around there, to the sheriff. You're convinced that there was nothing important here? Nothing that would point to any motive? Sheriff. Nothing here but kitchen things. The county attorney, after again looking around the kitchen, opens the door of a cupboard closet. He gets up on a chair and looks on a shelf, pulls his hand away, sticky. County Attorney. Here's a nice mess. The women draw nearer. Mrs. Peters to the other woman. Oh, that's her fruit. It did freeze. To the lawyer. She worried about that when it turned so cold. She said the fire'd go out and her jars would break. Sheriff. Well, you can't beat the woman. Held for murder and worrying about her preserves. County Attorney. I guess before we're through she may have something more serious than preserves to worry about. Hale. Well, women are used to worrying over trifles. The two women move a little closer together. County Attorney, with the gallantry of a young politician. And yet, for all their worries, what would we do without the ladies? The women do not unbend. He goes to the sink, takes a dipperful of water from the pail, and pouring it into a basin, washes his hands, starts to wipe them on the roller towel, turns it for a cleaner place. Dirty towels! Kicks his foot against the pans under the sink. Not much of a housekeeper, would you say, ladies? Mrs. Hale, stiffly. There's a great deal of work to be done on a farm. County Attorney. To be sure, and yet, with a little bow to her, I know there are some Dixon County farmhouses which do not have such roller towels. He gives it a pull to expose its length again. Mrs. Hale. Those towels get dirty awful quick. Men's hands aren't always as clean as they might be. County Attorney. Ah, loyal to your sex, I see. But you and Mrs. Wright were neighbors. I suppose you were friends, too. Mrs. Hale, shaking her head. I've not seen much of her in late years. I've not been in this house. It's more than a year. County Attorney. And why was that? You didn't like her? Mrs. Hale. I liked her all well enough. Farmers' wives have their hands full